Hello and welcome back to Inside Update, where every other week we are catching up about important headlines across Connecticut, brought to you by the InsideInvestigator.org team, who have been hard at work tracking down stories and bringing them to you via our website. I'll mention before we jump in as a reminder that you can sign up for free to get our emails and get all of our stories delivered straight to your inbox by going to InsideInvestigator.org. Enter your email right at the top of that homepage. Super easy stuff. Let's jump into three topics. One, a new investigation from Mark. It's called Best Interests of the Child. It's part three now of the family court investigation series that he has done. We're going to talk about a housing bill that aims to make it easier for felons to find housing. And then we're also going to talk about another bill that's being considered that's going to send state workers back to the office. Now, that one has gotten a lot of attention. I don't know if it's state workers who are nervous or excited, but it's been one of our most popular stories of the past week. So let's jump right in. Mark, you have been inundated with calls, inundated with emails. You have been fielding the landscape here from the family court system for months now. This was a great investigation. Could you bring us up to speed?
Yeah, what interested me about this was, from my previous looks at the family court system, women were claiming that when an allegation of parental alienation was made by their exes, basically that they were in danger of losing custody of their kids. And parental alienation is this idea that has taken hold in family court systems that when a child is resistant to seeing another parent, it's because their mind has been poisoned against that parent by the custodial parent. And this comes up a lot in issues that in divorces that involve either spousal abuse or child abuse. And women were telling me that, they're not even allowed to mention child abuse or domestic abuse in court anymore because then they face this parental alienation claim. And studies have shown that about half the time when those claims are made, custody is changed within the court system. So it's a big thing that's been going on. The UN even did a study on it, calling it this pseudo theory that puts people in danger. It's this very disputed idea that has really taken root. And so with this, I actually got to watch the whole process play out in court. And that was the primary interest for me was I hear about these things and there's studies about them, but this time I actually got to watch it play out. It involves a woman named Casey. She is fighting to retain custody of her kids from her ex-husband, who they had a domestic violence incident that led to the ending of the marriage. And she was assigned a court-appointed psychologist to handle reunification therapy with the kids. When the kids were resistant to going to that reunification therapy, and the therapy ended up not happening, the psychologist was brought in to testify that she was alienating the children from her ex-husband and that a change in custody was necessary to right this wrong. And so I was, okay, I want to see how this plays out. I mean, she was being held in contempt of court for not following the therapeutic orders. It was the fourth attempt at reunification therapy for the kids. Obviously, there's a lot of PTSD and issues going on, but it was I got to listen to the entire transcript where the psychologist was brought up to testify. He and Casey did not have a very good relationship. I mean, almost from the start. And he's a well-known psychologist when it comes to parental alienation. He's taught classes on it. He's handled over 2,400 court cases. And so we looked into her case and we looked into some previous cases where these court appointed experts, these psychologists and reunification specialists and things, have been called into question, some of their judgment, and even goes to the Photos Doulos case with Jennifer Doulos, missing and presumed murdered. Two court-appointed psychologists came in and said, "Hey, Fotis Dulos, great guy." Um, and the judge promptly tossed both those reports. And obviously, we saw what happened. So I think it brings up a lot of questions as to A, who are these experts that the court is relying on to make these custody determinations? And B, should the court be relying on these psychologists? I mean, psychology is not an exact science. It is an educated, opinion essentially. So, and we've seen instances in our country's past where psychologists and psychiatrists have really picked up ideas and run with them very far, that were later proven to just be absolute bunk. And I worry that this might be one of those instances. So, check the piece out, and I think people will get a pretty good idea of what women across the country are claiming is the problem here.
Yeah, there's a lot to unpack. There, in some ways, I feel bad, right? I want to push people to go and read it, but it always feels like such a tease to kind of lay out these few details. Obviously, if you're watching or listening to this, you can kind of get the general idea. But Mark, you did a fantastic job. I mean, the writing, it was emotional to read too. I think that was one of the hardest parts about this series generally, but this piece in particular is your heart just breaks for the people who are going through this. So I don't know if there's more that you want to add on that front, but I really would encourage everyone to go and read it. It's worth the time for all three of them, but especially this one.
Yeah, it's a long piece, but it definitely tells a story. And, by the end, she's right back in court facing the same charges again. So you see this cycle continuing. And one other thing I'd like to bring up, the court system, to get the recordings of the court proceedings, they give it to you on CD. And I couldn't I went to my local pawn shop and couldn't find a CD player. I ended up having to listen to 3 hours of a court hearing while driving in my car, recording it on my digital recorder. So this was like a week's worth of driving around, listening to these court proceedings, while simultaneously recording them, because who has a CD player these days? Sorry, guys. Let's up the game a little bit.
For sure. That's a great point. Probably actually more cost efficient to do it online and do digital preservation of these records as well. So that's yeah, I don't know. If someone want to write an op-ed to that effect, we'd consider running that on our opinion page for sure. That's good stuff. Mark, thank you. Seriously, this is something I know we have, even since that article, we've gotten dozens of additional tips. I think it's a pretty high bar for continuing to go into a part four. But of course, if anyone has evidence of corruption, financial misdeeds in the family court system or any court system in Connecticut, please reach out to us either through our whistleblower portal or by emailing tips@insideinvestigator.org. All right, logistics aside, I want to talk about this bill that makes it easier for felons to find housing, or at least that's what I understand where this is headed. Pretty controversial. Brandon, you wrote about this. You listened in. Give us the rundown.
Yep. So the bill is HB 5242, and essentially it would work to prevent landlords from considering felony convictions after, I believe, 3 years of no crimes. And so the idea of the bill is to kind of cut down on discrimination against felons, or former felons, however you want to phrase it, from landlords, because there's plenty who would claim, and there was plenty who came and testified at the meeting. It was a housing committee meeting, that basically they can't find housing and they don't know what they need to get housing, because people were claiming that, Never had any complaints from past landlords. I've held down a job since I've been out. I've done this, I've done that. And so basically, a lot of them were posing it as this is kind of my last step into fully reintegrating into society. And, it's not this difficult to find work, but it is very difficult to find housing. And on the other side of the coin, of course, are the landlords, because they argued that essentially this bill would make them way more liable. There was one who argued that, it's not difficult for felons to find work because the government provides tax credits to places of employment. Whereas in this bill, there would be, kind of no carrot for landlords. There's no real incentive for them to provide housing. And in fact, another controversial aspect of the bill would actually rely upon the tenants to kind of screen the felons themselves. And there were several factors, one of which was their level of rehabilitation. And that's kind of difficult to quantify. I imagine even for experts, or that's kind of a psychiatric evaluation that you're asking of landlords, who of course are not psychiatrists typically. So there was a lot of contention over the bill. It seemed like the committee was really pro the bill. It seemed like there was a lot of voices there who wanted to move forward with it. There was one, I believe, Senator Sampson, who was kind of on the fence about it. So we'll see. The bill has already been drafted, but we'll see if they add any more language that would kind of, provide that incentive to the landlords, because as it stands now, it's kind of, I see the purpose of the bill, and I do think that there is something that needs to be done, because you can't keep punishing people who have already done their time. But at the end of the day, you probably shouldn't punish landlords too, because there's, who's to say who's rehabilitated and who's not. So it puts them at risk as well. So it was really interesting discussions that were had over it. There was a lot of great testimony on both sides, and kind of looking forward to keeping track of it.
I'm curious how tenants would end up screening a potential, applicant. I mean, I live in an apartment building. I kind of don't want that responsibility. And if you start thinking about like these larger apartment buildings where you've got maybe hundreds, you know,
Did I say tenants? If I said tenants, it's for the landlords to screen the applicants, not the
oh, okay. I thought
that would
one
be
part of
even
the
crazier.
all right, yeah. I thought you said one part of the bill would be the tenants, and I'm just like, huh. All
Like an
right.
HOA board trying to make a determination. Yeah.
Yeah,
But there,
that
the list that you put in that article, I mean, was pretty significant in terms of, they'd have to jump through hoops to say, hey, yes, we're denying you right off the bat because we want to do further screening. And then there was kind of a laundry list that landlords would have to go through and then prove, which, yeah, any landlord that I know doesn't exactly strike me as folks with a ton of free time to go in and do that kind of stuff, let alone their qualifications. It's kind of obviously not something we're going to be able to parse out in this episode, but kind of cuts to the heart of what it means to have justice, though, in Connecticut. I mean, yes, if you served your time, you're past, but again, it's your property. I don't know. It seems like that's kind of a tough one on the other end, because if you don't want to rent to someone, should you be forced to do so?
Yeah, and that's what a lot of the landlords were saying. It seemed like there were some who were sympathetic to it, and there was one, I believe, let me see her name here. Naomi Freeman. I can't find her first name. I'm pretty sure it was Naomi, but she had stated that, she'd worked with a housing program in New Haven that works to find housing for, formerly incarcerated people, lots of them felons. And she said, even with a lot of resources, sometimes the tenants can be hard to handle. And there are incidents that happen, and some of them involving tenants who weren't formerly incarcerated. Sometimes there's property damage. And she said that basically this bill would make it difficult, because not only is there the whole screening process, but if a tenant is or if an applicant is denied their application and they feel that it was due to the fact that they were a felon, then they can kind of submit an appeals. There's like a whole appeals process, and the CHRO would have to look into it, and they would try and get back in, a timely fashion as to whether or not it'll end up timely. We shall see. To get back to the landlord and the applicant and kind of, lay down their basically just give their verdict as to whether or not they think that the applicant was being unfairly discriminated against. And if they do come to that conclusion, then it could potentially open up the landlord for litigation. And so that's, it's a scary word for anyone, but especially for landlords. So there's a lot of moving parts in this bill. And I think they're going to have to take some time to really center the interests of both parties. Because as it stands right now, it seems like there's a lot more to lose and not a lot to gain for landlords in the bill's current state.
For sure. Mark, one quick question for you. I know you've written about evictions previously, because I think this is the other part. Let's say that everything does go well and then something goes sideways. What's the status for Connecticut right now, as you've seen it, in terms of being able to evict someone who does turn out to not treat your property very well?
I mean, you can still evict somebody. There was an eviction moratorium during COVID, but that's over now. And evictions are actually on the higher end at this point compared to historical figures. And, part of that might just be, the spike after COVID, and maybe it's coming down after that. But, years ago, I had interviewed a landlord. He wasn't a big, like, he owned one building. He was a mailman. And he had a tenant in there that is absolutely destroying the place, and he couldn't get her out. He had been trying for years. And so I think landlords have been taking it on the chin in Connecticut, both policy wise and optics wise, the past few years especially. So I'd be curious if the legislature would essentially give them one more, like pile on them a little bit more. Don't know. I haven't really taken the temperature there on this issue, but as far as in the media and policy wise, they feel like they're constantly on the defensive. And I know that from speaking with there is an association of landlords and things like that. But yeah, they're constantly playing defense against stuff like this. I don't know. We'll see.
All right, we'll have to keep tracking it. Oh no, we're gonna have to write more stories, guys. Turns out that's it. All right, Brandon, thank you for that. That was a really well written article. Everyone should really be reading every single article that these three put out, but especially Brandon, brand new. The workload to read all of his content is a lot less than Catherine or Mark at this point to get 100% caught up. I'd like to ask Catherine then, as our last topic. You wrote about a bill that would send state workers back to the office, and we got thousands and thousands and thousands of people looking at this across social media platforms, on our website, on aggregators. It seemed like it struck a nerve. I'm not sure, again, if that's employees who are trying to figure out what's going on with their own work, or if it's just generally getting the temperature of back to office push generally. What's going on with this bill, though?
I think based on the amount of written testimony that was submitted on this bill, you're probably right with that guess there, Connor. So basically, what this bill would do is it would allow the commissioners of agencies who deal with human services, so things like DCF and the Department of Social Services, to craft a return to the office policy for employees, and they would be able to require that state workers in those agencies are in their office at their desk up to 60% of the time, which is different than what it is now post-pandemic. I think each state agency has a different policy, but according to testimony that was submitted by workers during the public hearing on the bill, DSS, at least certain workers are remote 60% of the time. And the concern with the bill, which was brought forward at the public hearing by Representative Candelora, was really whether with so many state workers working remotely, whether state agencies are functioning effectively. I mean, I know it's a conversation we've had behind the scenes here a lot about how difficult it can be when you're trying to get somebody on the phone in certain agencies. And one of the real drivers behind the bill, according to Representative Candelora, was the number of recent deaths that have occurred in cases where DCF was involved with several incidents. And one of the reports from the Office of the Child Advocate specifically says that the legislature needs to look at remote work policies and see if those are playing a role. Now, I think it's important to note that this is not a bring everybody back into the office regardless of, where they work, what they do. This is a very specific, very narrow. Representative Candelora seemed to want to take a broader look at it, a broader look at what the impact of remote work is on the state and on state agency efficiency, but that's not what this bill would do. And a lot of the legislators on the committee, this was before the Labor Committee, I think we're also very concerned with sort of narrowly tailoring this kind of policy and not, if there are people who are working from home and it is working, not necessarily disrupting that. But if there are people like case workers or other types of workers who need to be out in the field, making sure that there's flexibility where the heads of those agencies can say, hey, you need to be out in the field and not at your desk. As you said, there seems to have been a lot of interest in this bill. There were over 300 pieces of written testimony that were submitted. And I would say the overwhelming majority, which is not normally a word we'd like to use in journalism, but I think I saw like 3 or 4 pieces of testimony that were in support of the bill. The rest were all in opposition. And they were mostly submitted by workers for DCF or DSS. And a lot of them were submitted anonymously. So I think that indicates that like people are very concerned about this bill. And also kind of concerned perhaps that there might be blowback if they publicly support coming out against this.
Interesting.
Yeah. I'm curious. I don't know if it came up, but the work from home policies that are currently, in state government. I mean, that was something that the unions, I think they went to arbitration over. And, in Connecticut, union contracts supersede state law, so it can overwrite state law. So I don't know what the contract right now is for DSS and DCF workers as far as, the union provisions on work from home. But I think if the legislature tried to pass a bill about it, they'd kind of, I think the unions might go, take them right back to arbitration or something like that, because it's like, we have this contract provision. You just passed a law, saying that this doesn't, that we can't enforce this anymore, that this isn't the way this will be operating. That could, that could set up be in a little bit of a pickle there.
Yeah, and that was the gist of some of the public testimony, was effectively this is an issue between the union and between these agencies. We've already settled it between us, and if we feel like there needs to be a change, then we can go back into that process and settle it between us, and it's not something that the legislature should be inserting itself in.
There is the whole other party of those receiving the services that doesn't seem to be part of that equation. Interestingly, I feel like we talk about feeling for the people who are impacted, but you can't imagine being in a crisis situation trying to get a hold of DCF and you're getting a voicemail. I just don't see how that can't be part of this conversation. Was that part of the testimony that you saw?
It was part of the testimony. Candelora actually recounted a constituent of his who he'd been in contact with the week before, who was a woman who had stage 4 cancer, who was scheduled to have surgery the next day. Her insurance policy was accidentally dropped by DSS. And the family spent 24 hours before this woman had to go into surgery trying to get somebody in the agency on the phone to make sure her surgery would be covered. They couldn't get anybody on the phone. They reached out to Candelora and were fortunately able to have it settled so that she didn't have to worry about that. But, A, not everybody's going to think to reach out to their representative. B, I think we all know that there's a lot of mail that our representatives receive and they don't always respond to things right away. And C, is that really the step that you should have to go to just to get a simple, especially something that's an accident, fixed?
Definitely another one that we need to be paying attention to, right? So we talk about journalism for humans by humans. A lot of human impact there going on. Credit to all three of you for the coverage that you've been doing and the work that has gone into these stories. Obviously, for those watching and listening, this is just a small fraction of what these three have put out in the last couple weeks. All of it can be found at insideinvestigator.org. Catherine, Mark, Brandon, thank you. Any other last points before we wrap up here? All right, wonderful. To all of you watching and listening, if you like what we do, please consider becoming a donor to Inside Investigator. We're a nonprofit, so you can head over to insideinvestigator.org, hit that donate button in the top right-hand corner to join the ranks of those who also support nonprofit journalism in Connecticut. We will be back in 2 weeks, and until then, be well, stay safe, and stay informed.